Increased interaction among terrorists, narco-traffickers, weapons proliferators, and organized criminals.
They're vicious, destructive, illegal, and a major problem.
Chemical and biological threats to the United States will become more widespread. Some terrorists or insurgents will attempt to use such weapons against U.S. interests.
So you can call it all drugs, thugs, and bugs, whether of the cyber or biological variety.
The likelihood will increase over this period that weapons of mass destruction will be used against the United States.
Our military strength and our economic superiority puts the crosshairs on our nation. We're the biggest one on the block.
Tonight, the year 2015, the CIA report. The President-elect and his senior staff have already begun receiving their intelligence briefings, but that will only intensify once they actually take office on Saturday. Operations already underway, crises in the making, security threats here at home, threats to American interests overseas. They will hear about them, you won't. Tonight and tomorrow, though, we'll be able to give you a hint of what awaits President Bush as the result of an unusual document recently released by the CIA. The Central Intelligence Agency used to be so paranoid about visitors that there were no exit signs off Virginia's George Washington Parkway even indicating its existence. That's changed. But you still don't get in without an invitation. The CIA gathers information from all over the world, but it only distributes what it finds to a relative handful of top government policymakers. The CIA's mission is to keep the president and his aides informed about other countries' secrets. What it finds, though, is usually highly classified. The intelligence community tends to worry about imminent crises. Only rarely does it enlist the aid of outside experts, and it almost never shares its findings with the rest of the world. Not so with this new report, Global Trends 2015. It draws on the best minds available within the government and in the academic and research communities. Published just in time for the new president, it is also unclassified. Increasingly sophisticated terrorists, more attacks, more casualties. A greater likelihood that the U.S. will be attacked by nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. Those are just two of the top concerns in the world of 2015 envisioned by the CIA. To begin with, there'll be too many people for many of the world's resources. By 2015, there will be 1 billion more people in the world. 95% of those people will live in poor nations, in crowded, urban megacities. Nearly half the world's population, 3 billion people, will have inadequate access to fresh water. The CIA projects that disease will continue to ravage the developing world. AIDS will devastate not just Africa, but India, Russia, and perhaps China as well. In Africa, average lifespans will be reduced by as much as 30 to 40 years. Wars have always been a part of the human condition, but never before have so many advanced weapons been accessible to so many people. India and Pakistan will continue to expand their nuclear arsenals, and the threat of war between them is projected as the most serious regional issue of the next 15 years. The world will be transformed by globalization, says the CIA, the rapid and free flow of information, goods, services, money, but most of all, people, moving from rural to urban areas, from poor, underdeveloped regions to the rich, developed countries of the world. And borders will become increasingly irrelevant. Governments will have less and less control. Criminal networks and terrorist organizations will use their wealth and expertise to exploit and attack the world's financial and computer networks. The CIA is warning that pictures familiar to us merely as distant images on the evening news are heading our way. The world is increasingly interconnected in today's world of computers, rapid air travel, and a global economy. Every threat travels, and every threat can reach our shores one way or the other. I spoke at length with several of the intelligence analysts who worked on the report. We'll be showing you edited excerpts from those discussions over the next 2 nights. John Gannon is an assistant director of the CIA and chairman of the National Intelligence Council, which put out the report.
What kind of conflicts are we going to confront in the world? Are we going to have major conflicts among developed countries? And the answer to that one is fairly obvious: no.
That's the good news. But the report also concludes that the threat of a missile attack on the United States with WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, is much more imminent. Quote, the probability that a missile armed with WMD would be used against U.S. forces or interests is higher today than during most of the Cold War and will continue to grow. Iran could test a long-range missile as early as this year. It's not a typo in the report. They mean this year. Iraq could have missiles capable of delivering nuclear payloads to the U.S. before 2015. And North Korea?
We project, in terms of the technical capabilities of North Korea, we see a growing challenge to us on the long-term ballistic missile threat.
But missiles are not even considered the likeliest means of delivery. Joe Cerencioni is a proliferation expert at a Washington think tank.
If you read the report carefully, you'll see that what we should be primarily worried about is weapons of mass destruction delivered by non-missile means, ones that could be smuggled in on a ship or delivered by a plane, for example.
During the last decade, already, terrorist attacks have killed or injured 22,000 people worldwide. The CIA report projects that we will look back on those last 10 years as the good old days. Quote, chemical and biological threats to the United States will become more widespread. Some terrorists or insurgents will attempt to use such weapons against U.S. interests. Between now and 2015, terrorist tactics will become increasingly sophisticated and designed to achieve mass casualties. I asked John Landry, a retired Army general and now a CIA analyst, what he thinks are the most likely hazards ahead.
We conclude that biological threats, we conclude that threats in terms of information operations against our infrastructure, such as banks, such as the electrical power grids, such as potentially our water resources, etc., are areas where we're going to have to pay increasing attention as we move into the next 2 decades.
One of the great debates in terms of military funding has been a defense system against missile attack, something that could cost $60 billion, $100 billion. You probably have a better appreciation of how much. And what has always struck me, and this part of the conversation highlights it for me, is that the greater danger may be some guy with a backpack coming in from Montreal.
It may be that some of these lesser threats won't require as much of an investment as to defend against ballistic threats. And I'm not sure that at the moment we can be satisfied with just doing one to the exclusion to the others.
I mean, the adversaries are going to be small governments that are, for one reason or another, unhappy with the United States, but also individuals. Even on the nuclear side, we don't just stress the strategic arsenals, but we also project the notion that an individual from a ship, you can launch in an unconventional way a nuclear or a biological or a chemical attack on the United States. A truck, a ship. So we are in an environment clearly where there is a greater danger that an individual will actually conduct such an operation than a major country would against the United States. And that's a very different kind of environment from the Cold War.
When we come back, we'll look at how terrorist groups are expected to evolve into even more dangerous threats over the next 15 years. Over the next 15 years, all of the instruments of power that used to be controlled almost exclusively by governments and huge corporations, money, armies, weapons, technology, information, national borders, all of those are going to be slipping gradually into other hands. In its projection for the year 2015, the CIA warns somewhat innocuously that non-state actors will play increasingly larger roles in national and international affairs. Non-state actors? Who or what, you may wonder, lies buried in that particular euphemism? Well, a multinational corporation is a non-state actor. So is a human rights group or any other non-government organization trying to influence political events. But those aren't the non-state actors keeping the intelligence community up at night. He is at least one of them. The terrorist leader Osama bin Laden has become almost a generic description of the CIA's main concern these days. He, drug cartels, other organized crime organizations, rogue states. The nightmare is that they will increasingly cooperate, link up, work in combination with one another. Quote, globalization, driven by information technology, will significantly increase interaction among terrorists, narco-traffickers, weapons proliferators, and organized criminals. General Anthony Zinni, the former chief of U.S. forces in the Mideast, says that in places like Afghanistan, where lawless groups operate with impunity, we're already seeing the link-up among terrorists, organized crime, and drug smugglers.
Right now, Afghanistan is the leading producer of opium products. And we know that the terrorist organization that moves weapons and terrorists and provides direction and logistics is also the same trail that moves drugs and narcotics. So now we see international crime and drug trafficking mixing with this extremism.
That's not the only place where criminal and terrorist groups are supplanting national governments.
We see the cartels, drug cartels in South America, same thing, more power, more resources, even than nation states around them.
There is concern that other governments may crumble and go the way of Afghanistan, places like Pakistan, where ethnic division and Islamic fundamentalism threaten to tear the country apart.
What happens when a nation disintegrates? Pakistan, for example. It's more than just economic dislocation. It's more than just mass migrations. Now we're talking about a country that has developed and weaponized nuclear weapons, whether a group such as bin Laden's group or an Islamic fundamentalist group or something that might emerge from a disintegrating Pakistan. For example, whether a group like that could acquire a nuclear weapon and smuggle it into the United States or fly it in on a FedEx plane and detonate it.
I raised some of these issues with the intelligence analysts who wrote the report.
Let me ask you to expand a little on something that really is relatively new, and that is the capability of a very small group, sometimes even an individual, using the new technologies that are available, and perhaps with access to a biological or a chemical weapon, to do enormous damage.
What you're talking about is the ability to, in fact, get under the defenses through the introduction of terrorist teams, sometimes in the form of biological warfare. It's a far different challenge, and it's a far greater challenge than what we've dealt with before, both in terms of intelligence and in terms of military capabilities.
As, for example, the narco-terrorists become more organized, better organized, use more sophisticated technological
Become
equipment.
more interconnected with organized criminals and with terrorists and networks that clearly allow them to do that.
Right. As that happens on the one hand, and as you project, the capacity of a government like the U.S. government to influence events diminishes slightly. I don't want to overstress that.
We are all, I think, persuaded that there are enough bad guys out there who are alienated and angry, and we also know that it is increasingly easy for them to get access to the information that they need to build a biological weapon or conduct bioterrorism.
Make that jump to the year 2015, though. I mean, what you're talking about is where we are right now.
That's right.
What's different 15 years from now?
The trajectory we see is an increasing threat, simply because of the ease with which this technology is going to be available to people who are disaffected.
In the past, we've at least known who our enemy was. In this kind of atmosphere, it's entirely possible that a biological warfare attack against the United States could take place. It would be a day or 2 or 3 days before we're even aware of the fact that it has taken place. The actor or actors would be long gone, and you would have no idea who struck.
That's why today we are placing an extraordinary premium on being able to attribute to any of the kinds of threats we've been talking about that might occur from terrorist groups or other non-state actors, to exactly who did it and where it came from, and to trace it back to its ultimate source. That will become a major objective, I would predict, between now and the next 15 years.
When we come back, we'll look at the role of the United States and how it will change in the year 2015. America is rich. America is powerful. American products are sold all over the world. American music is heard everywhere. American movies and television programs are seen almost everywhere. That is the good news and the bad. It makes America the object of widespread admiration, but also of resentment. David Gordon is an intelligence analyst specializing in economics.
The United States will continue to be the dominant power in the world in terms of the size of our economy, the size of our financial sector, our military might, our leading edge in science and technology. But increasingly, over the next 15 years, American influence in the world will be connected to forces that aren't governmental. So it's the power of American culture, the power of Hollywood, the power of our large corporations.
Let's dig a little deeper into that, if you don't mind. And let's start with what seems on the face of it to be the silliest example, Hollywood.
Hollywood will provide a picture of the United States society, a picture of American values, a picture of the good life that could serve as a focal point for people who are relatively less privileged in the world, who have complaints against the international system, against the United States. It could serve as a focal point for opposition to a larger American culture and society, despite any antagonistic motivation on the part of the U.S. government or of the broader citizenry of the United States.
Others out in the world who see these messages as, for whatever reason, threatening, will blame it to at least some extent on some large entity which they think of as the United States of America.
Globalization is going to apply itself very unevenly over the next 15 years. And for the United States, how well we manage the potentially alienated or disaffected in the world is going to have an impact on all those issues we talked about, from terrorism to the use of weapons of mass destruction, because those are the people, the disaffected, the alienated, they're going to be who will be tempted to express their disaffection with these instruments.
You're showing us the ghost of Christmas as it may be, not necessarily as it has to be.
There are opportunities outlined in this document as well as threats and dangers. And the future in 2015 will depend upon how well we take advantage of those opportunities and exploit them. Because if we don't, we're likely to end up in a world that we have been talking about for the greater part of this afternoon, low-intensity conflict among a large number of states with very tremendous difficulties that we've talked about. The potential for conflict between rising powers like China and India and others, possibly for a breakup of very large states like Russia and like Indonesia that could spill over into very great, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
Our new president will be confronting a world in which American influence is increasingly prominent, even as the U.S. government is less and less able to influence events directly. The president will confront a world seized by the spread of AIDS and other communicable diseases, in which countries go to war over water and governments are toppled by the demands of exploding populations. All of that in Part 2 of 2015, the CIA report, tomorrow night. There are just 36 and a half hours left now to the Clinton presidency. This evening, the president appeared on television to look back for a few nostalgic moments, but he, better than anyone, understands the nature of the transition that is already underway. The nation's promise and problems, insofar as they can be affected by the president, are about to become another man's concern.
The forces of integration that have created these good opportunities also make us more subject to global forces of destruction, to terrorism, organized crime, and narco-trafficking, the spread of deadly weapons and disease, the degradation of the global environment.
Last night on this broadcast, we focused on a recently issued CIA report that sketches out the intelligence community's best take on which problems are likely to develop into potential crises over the next 15 years. It is an unclassified report prepared in conjunction with a number of experts and specialists who are not themselves part of the intelligence community. We began yesterday by focusing on the growing dangers of terrorism, state-sponsored and otherwise. Tonight, we'll be looking at some of the conditions that lead to violence, the struggle for precious resources, the pressures that grow out of unrestrained population growth and movement, the effect of uncontrolled diseases. All of these have tendencies to combine and interact with one another in ways that are specifically unpredictable, but which demand preparation nevertheless. Even as America celebrates one of its most precious traditions, the peaceful transition of power from one administration to another, these are the issues that will demand immediate attention. What, other than compassion, should cause Americans to be concerned about the health of other people in distant nations? That's where we begin tonight with this report from Nightline correspondent Dave Marrish.
In the beginning, when the CIA was founded, national security focused on a single question: which nations have the most dangerous weapons? Then came the new era, the Cold War over, the Soviet threat sharply reduced, and the discovery that American interests could be attacked not just by bombs, but by bacteriological bugs packaged as weapons like anthrax, or by rampant infectious diseases like staph or malaria, or by narcotic drugs.
This is crack cocaine.
George Bush made the first big shift in the definition of national security by adding international narco-terrorism to the definition.
President Bush the Elder's new assignment for the intelligence community, says Pulitzer Prize-winning Newsday reporter Laurie Garrett, raised a new and basic question.
What destabilizes nations? The answer has often turned out to be threats to the health of the people.
When the health threat is an infectious disease like tuberculosis, now rampant across the states of the former Soviet Union, or AIDS, the destabilization threatens not just nations, but regions, continents, the world.
It's important to deal with these problems where we find them, and at the beginnings when they may be easier to deal with and before they become significant problems.
AIDS is not just a health issue. AIDS is an economic issue. AIDS is a stability and security issue. So we're able to approach it from many vantage points, and that makes a big difference.
The CIA's contribution, Thurman says, has produced new and better information for the president and his policymakers, and important on the battlefields of inside the Beltway, Washington, new and stronger advocates for the strategic importance of fighting infectious disease. In the 21st century at the CIA, the mission will be more than ballistic missiles and atomic spies. Industrial espionage, economic and climate shifts, and the world's public health are now recognized parts of America's security agenda. I'm Dave Marish for Nightline.
I spoke with several of the intelligence analysts who worked on the report issued by the CIA.
One of the things that we're most concerned about, and that the American people will need to be concerned about, is urban areas in poor countries as hot zones for infectious diseases. And we're seeing that most prominently today in sub-Saharan Africa with the spread of the AIDS pandemic. AIDS today is overwhelmingly a sub-Saharan African issue. But as we look out over the next 15 years, AIDS is moving out into other areas.
I'm sitting in Cleveland.
That's right.
I'm saying I really feel bad about those poor people in sub-Saharan Africa, but I've got a toothache.
Diseases don't know borders. It's not certain that AIDS will not continue to evolve into new strains that could even come back here into the United States. This is going to be a constant struggle. There are other diseases, tuberculosis.
Big outbreak of that in Russia now.
Big outbreak in Russia, and that's one that we're quite concerned about.
Because?
It's an airborne disease. It is transmitted a lot easier than is HIV/AIDS. It's not by physical contact.
Well, let me talk about connecting issues. Go back to your friend in Cleveland, who might care about the AIDS epidemic in Africa, but not really care if he or she doesn't believe it's going to impact on that. But if I take the issue of regional conflict, and with that comes the requirement at times for peacekeeping forces that will hopefully prevent military intervention. And if the United States is to be involved in any of that, it means that U.S. citizens, U.S. soldiers, U.S. diplomats are going to be sent to these areas. So if you have a correspondence between those areas where you're going to have this regional conflict and very high incidence of infectious diseases, and it is not just AIDS, it's also hepatitis C, hemorrhagic fever, strains that do not have cures, then we have to know about these challenges, because they are security threats to our people, just as our bullets.
By 2015, there will be another billion people crowded onto this planet in places that can ill afford the additional population. The consequences when we come back. Over the next 15 years, the CIA projects that the world will see a population explosion concentrated in poor urban areas and mass migration of people from less developed regions to the West. ABC's Richard Gisbert has more.
It was a random act of symbolism, but a milestone nonetheless. On October 12, 1999, the United Nations declared that this baby born in Sarajevo was the 6 billionth person on Earth. Now consider this. Before that child turns 16, there will be another billion humans on the planet. By 2015, we will be 7.2 billion people. But the more significant numbers are these. 95% of the population growth, that's 19 out of every 20 additional people, will be in the developing world, in the kinds of countries that often cannot cope as it is. Another 300 million in India alone, soon to become the second country to go over a billion. Just this week, India saw the largest human gathering in history. 70 million people sharing in a Hindu ritual. The swelling population will accelerate the human migration for economic reasons from rural areas to urban. There will be more megacities like Cairo. In 1950, 2 million people lived here. By 2015, it will be 14 million.
Everything that's required for urban life has to be doubled, tripled, quadrupled in a very short period of time. And those are the settings in which you can get lots of political turmoil.
Those are ripe conditions for more of the kinds of conflicts the world has seen ever since the end of the Cold War. One ethnic group against another. In many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, half the population is under 20. Too many people who, come 2015, will be looking for too few jobs. That's destabilizing too. So millions of people will try to come here, the first world, and they will find that in most places they're not welcome. Which is ironic because the developed world can use more young blood. Birth rates have declined, the elderly are living longer, and with too few people paying into pension and healthcare systems and too many drawing from them, something will have to give. If you think the world is a crowded, complicated, and hazardous place now, just wait until this child turns 15. For Nightline, I'm Richard Gisbert in London.
Of the population increase in the world, I think literally 30 or 40% of it is likely to be in India. India in general is going to be looming larger on our screens over the next 15 years. Here's a country that both has the largest middle-class population in the world. By Indian standards, there are more middle-class Indians than there are middle-class Americans, but there are also more impoverished people in India than there are in all of sub-Saharan Africa. So you have cities like Delhi, Mumbai, which used to be called Bombay, Calcutta, and several others will be among the largest cities in the world.
Bombay, for example.
3 million in 1950, under 3 million, 30 million in 2015.
One city.
One city.
Tick off a few of the others while you've got the map open in front of you.
Is there. Karachi, Pakistan was only 1 million people in 1950. It will be 20 million people.
All right, why do I care? Why does it matter to me?
Some of the issues begin to intersect. Population has a very significant impact on the natural resource question, for example. So if you take the Middle East and look at the water problem, increased urbanization puts further stress on limited natural resources, and then you start getting into the intersection with economics also, and then issues of violence and terrorism, and it all begins to connect.
India, China on the rise, Russia on the decline. They all have highly unequal distribution of political and economic power within their societies. And if any one of them, or more than one of them, were to break apart or to have high levels of instability, it's very hard to predict in those circumstances what the follow-on effects would be.
Where you don't have effective government, where you don't have the rule of law, where you don't have the ability to make the investments in sewers, in public transportation, in schools, in healthcare facilities, there, urbanization could be a very scary phenomenon.
And if I could just interrupt us for a moment, we'll have more when we come back.
According to that report issued by the CIA, there will be, by the year 2015, an enormous increase in the demand for oil and natural gas. But the forecast is that drilling technology should be able to keep up with demand, barring political complications. But water? Well, water is another story.
Water, to just go back to the basics, life of all kinds depends on it. There's no substitute for it. It is replenished, but at a finite rate. And it's very unevenly distributed. I mean, in our country, we are enormously blessed. In Canada, they're enormously blessed. But about half of the people in the world by 2015 will live in water scarcity areas where they have very low per capita amounts of water, too little to sustain whatever their pre-existing level of agricultural or industrial or household usage was, that level of usage.
Forgive the pun, but that sounds a little dry, but of course it isn't, because that's what leads to wars.
Well, it could lead to wars. I mean, it's going to lead to a lot of of problems.
Where?
For those societies, and
Well,
they're
where?
very important societies.
I mean, for
much of
example, Iraq, Turkey, Syria.
Middle East, North Africa, much of northern China, much of northern India and Pakistan and adjacent parts of Central Asia. Mexico is increasingly dry. I mean, these are important countries to us, whether or not they are conflictual. And as economic growth improves because of population growth, because of urbanization, the problem just gets worse.
I was looking at one of your charts, and I must say one of the things that struck me is after 50 years of the United States being in the green, which meant above average water supply, you're projecting that by the year 2015, we suddenly turn yellow.
Parts of our country, of course, are very water scarce. All the results of population growth and economic growth bear on intense use of water, and that's not going to change in this period. And over the next 15 years, there's really not much of a way to roll it back. I mean, there's some things you could do about it, but there's not a lot you can do about it.
I mean, one of the ways to conserve, of course, is to control population, and that is not going to happen in the Middle East. So the competition for water is clearly going to grow, and it is already in a region where the potential for conflict over water is higher than anywhere else in the world. So we're not predicting conflict there, but we're saying, folks, this problem is getting worse, and you know the math just doesn't add up to a solution here.
ABC's national security correspondent John McWethy has more on the looming water crisis.
Wars have been fought over land, over oil, over religion and race. Next may be water. As populations grow, the planet is entering a new era of water crisis unlike anything the world has seen before.
I think water is much more of a concern than oil, to be honest with you, because water essentially has no substitutes. The degree of water scarcity we're about to experience, I think, is unprecedented.
The CIA forecasts potentially disastrous water shortages in the next 15 years, brought on by exploding population growth in many parts of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The Nile River is one potential trouble spot. At the mouth is Egypt, the region's largest military power that now uses most of the river's water. At the source is Ethiopia, where 85% of the Nile's water comes from. Today, Ethiopia uses little of the water, but with its population growing at a rate of 1 million people every 8 months, Ethiopia is planning major dams to divert water for irrigation. The flow to Egypt will be sharply reduced.
Egypt depends on the Nile for 99% of its water. It has virtually no other source.
This is one of the highest priorities in terms of their own security. It really reflects their very existence.
Conflict inevitable?
I think it's dangerous.
That kind of conflict would have huge implications for the United States, a close friend of Egypt, as would the case of another ally, Turkey. In both instances, if there is war, American troops may well be drawn into the fight trying to stop it. Turkey's case involves the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that both originate inside Turkish territory, then flow through Syria and Iraq. After centuries of using little of the water, Turkey is now developing that part of the country, building a massive complex of 22 dams. Syria and Iraq, both with large standing armies, are unlikely to accept a crippling cut in water. But the stresses caused by exploding populations and increased water use can also cause problems, even violence, within a country. Take the world's two most populous nations.
China and India are the two top irrigators in the world. Most of the major irrigated areas in both of those countries today are in situations where their water use is not sustainable.
Famine and food riots could threaten a government's stability.
If you don't have enough water to meet your basic needs, you don't have a viable economy, you don't have a viable society.
So what can the United States do? first, says the CIA, recognize there is a new and dangerous problem, then exert diplomatic muscle to get the nations most affected to negotiate and plan. Not very sexy, but it beats fighting a war. John McWethy for Nightline at the Pentagon.
I'll have a closing thought when we come back.
The only prediction that we can ever make with any certainty as one president assumes power from another is that no man assuming the office ever knows from which quarter his first crisis will come. The best efforts of the intelligence community are inevitably inadequate in that respect. But in this age of jet travel, instant communication, and fearsome weapons, overpopulation, regional scarcities, and diseases in the remotest corners of the world all have the capacity to become our problems. We can only try to understand and to be prepared. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.